So a question I get asked a lot of times is, where do I deploy my web application or API on AWS? Now, the reason I get asked this question is because on AWS, you have so many services for doing almost the same thing that people who are new to cloud services or like just cloud in general feel intimidated by. Now, example, if you want to like deploy a database, you have Aurora, you have RDS, you have DynamoDB, and then you got like tons of services for just doing almost the same thing. And that case is true for web development as well, especially in the case of backend APIs and application servers. So, for example, over here I have listed probably the most common ones that people use when they're deploying their web application or API. We got Elastic Beanstalk, we got Elastic Container Service, also known as EC2. Then we got Lambda, Lightsail, AppRunner, and last but not the least, EC2, which is a very, very popular one. Now, in this video, I'm going to explain which services I would personally use. Okay, like everyone's opinions are different, so don't get angry if I say something that you don't like. But this video is going to be about my opinions about where you should host your APIs or web applications, and I will give reasons, proper reasons to why you should or should not use something. Okay, so first of all, let's get started with Elastic Beanstalk. Now, Elastic Beanstalk is probably the service that most people would go with when they want to deploy their web application or API on AWS. It's because Elastic Beanstalk basically manages a lot of stuff for you, and it abstracts away a lot of the complexity, even though if you want to, you can have direct access to the infrastructure, you can configure stuff. But it just abstracts away the stuff from you so that you don't need to worry about your infrastructure. Rather, you can focus on your business logic and the application or API itself. Now, so these are like the good things of the Elastic Beanstalk, but let me actually tell you what happens when you like deploy an application to Elastic Beanstalk, because I've mentioned that it's a managed service. So the first thing that happens is that you get an EC2 instance, maybe one EC2 instance, or maybe more, depending on your needs. Then you get an S3 bucket. So the S3 bucket is used to store your application's code. Now, I don't know why you need an S3 bucket to store your application's code. You can just probably store it like in a Git repository, and the EC2 can just pull from the Git repository and run the code. And then last but not least, you get a load balancer. That was a long L. So you get a load balancer. Now, that's all nice, but the problem with Elastic Beanstalk is the load balancer. Okay, now, if you are someone who's new to cloud computing, who's on a tight budget, or you just don't want to spend a lot of money on learning how to use the cloud, or, you don't want to spend a lot of money deploying your web application, the Elastic Load Balancer would probably this load balancer, this would probably cost the most amount of money like out of all of your AWS resource usages. Now, I don't know why AWS does that, but whenever I use this load balancer, my cost just like skyrockets. And when I check my billing dashboard, the thing that took up 90% of my costs is just the load balancer. Like, not the EC2, not the S3, is the load balancer. And that's the reason why I try to avoid using the AWS load balancer as much as I can. So the Elastic Beanstalk is like, if you want to deploy a production application, the Elastic Beanstalk service is a very nice one. Like, if you're willing to spend money for the load balancer so that all of your traffic, like let's say your website has like 1,000 users, that's like a low amount of numbers, but let's say it has 10,000 users, if you have the load balancer, the elastic load balancer, your traffic will get distributed to like multiple instances of your application. So that is a good thing. But if you're just someone who wants to deploy a simple application, which will not have a lot of users and just a single EC2 instance or a single server is enough to handle them, I don't think you need a load balancer. So the Elastic Beanstalk, I don't think it would be worth it for you. Just saying. So there goes the Elastic Beanstalk. Let me actually mark that out. So there goes the Elastic Beanstalk. Now you have the Elastic Container Service. Now the way the Elastic Container Service works, it's a bit different than how the other services work, but it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you use the Elastic Container Service to not just run web applications or API, but any kind of containerized application, like example Docker containers. So if there is some kind of application that you can containerize, you can probably run that on the Elastic Container Service. Maybe it's like a simple job, like a simple background task that runs every n amount of times, maybe like every day, makes an API request to somewhere, wherever. It can be run with the Elastic Container Service. Now, the Elastic Container Service, it has like two branches, if I may say that. One is Fargate, and the other is EC2. So basically, you can deploy your application on the Elastic Container Service in two ways. You can either use Fargate or you can use EC2. I always forget the C there. So now the thing is, which one should I use? So let's say you want to deploy an application to ECS, so Elastic Container Service. Now, Fargate and EC2, the way they work, they're a bit different. Fargate is almost like a serverless kind of thing where you're only paying for the amount of resources like CPU resources, RAM usages that your task, which is the container, like the amount of resources that your container uses. So in ECS terms, a container is basically called a task. Okay, so each service. So this is basically how it works. So let's say you have a cluster. So a cluster, your cluster can be like for a single startup, like or your company or your MVP. You can have one cluster, and each cluster can have multiple services. So let's say this is a service. Okay, we have two services here. So we have two services. So each service, let's say we are having let's say it's a microservice application thingy. So you have, for example, you have the, let's say you have the cart service. So it's the cart service. Don't mind my handwriting. The cart service, and then there is the catalog service. So you can use the Elastic Container Service to basically have a cluster of services. Now, each service can have multiple tasks. So in this case, each task is a container. So let's say you have a service that needs to scale up. So you can deploy multiple containers or instances of that single service, and that would be the task. So each service can have multiple tasks. So let's say I have two tasks here. This is instance 1, this is instance 2. Both of them are tasks. And we have 3 here. So we have 1, 2, 3. And this whole thing is the, oh god, the cluster. Wow, right? Drawing with a mouse is hard. So this whole thing is a cluster. Now, this is basically how Elastic Container Service works. Now, this would be a good thing if you want to deploy a microservice-oriented application. But the thing is, since there are multiple instances of every service, so there are multiple tasks, you need some kind of load balancer to balance them out. Now, I think you get where I'm going. Okay, so you need to use the Elastic Load Balancer unless you want to deploy your custom HA proxy or Nginx instance to load balance the stuff. But the Elastic Load Balancer is a nice one, but yeah, unless you are some kind of startup or some person who wants to spend a lot of money on, deploying load balancers, well, yeah, go for it. But unless like, but if you don't have a high budget, if you don't want to spend a lot of money on the cloud, I think you should avoid using anything that requires the elastic load balancer, because it requires like it basically like yeah, it's sort of expensive if you run it for a long time and there's like tons of traffic to your website. So yeah, if you want to use like this, the Elastic Container Service, yeah, you need a load balancer. And if you're deploying a microservice oriented application, I recommend you go with the Elastic Container Service, but you need a load balancer for that. Okay, so there goes the Elastic Container Service, or the ECS. Okay, so we're done with the Elastic Container Service. So let me actually check this one. Now we have Lambda. Now, Lambda is probably one of the most popular services on AWS for deploying your web application or API. Now, Lambda is an event-driven like thing where basically if you only pay for the amount of resources, for the amount of computation time a single request takes. Now, the issue with Lambda is that like you cannot use a specific web framework with it. Okay, so let's say let's say you want to make a web application in Python Flask or Django or Fast API, or in Node.js you have Express or Nest.js. With Lambda you can't do that because since Lambda is serverless, you need to basically do it the way the AWS Lambda API tells you to. So you're going to have like a function that receives a Lambda event, and then it returns some kind of JSON or some kind of data. So that's basically how Lambda works. And like you don't run a server 24/7. You have like a few functions which respond to events, so you can't use a specific web framework with it. So that's basically the downside of Lambda. But except that, if you're someone who is making a simple web application which won't have tons of traffic, and you you don't want to like, use a specific web framework, you're okay with using the Lambda API, yeah, go on ahead. Lambda is a very, very nice option, and if I wanted to deploy my application to serverless or and it didn't have like a lot of users, I would deploy it to Lambda if I wasn't bound to like a specific web framework. But the downside with Lambda is like another downside is that since you pay for the amount of time every request takes and the amount of resources every request uses, if your Lambda endpoint or your Lambda API has like a lot of requests and stuff, you like all of them is gonna like, pile up and it's gonna cost a lot of money. And that is something that happened to Ben Awad, if you know. So basically he had a VS Code extension called Vicender, and that had a Lambda API, so like an API on AWS Lambda. But some guy found his Lambda endpoint, spammed it with requests, and that costed him some money. Like a lot of money, like $50 or something. So yeah, if you don't want to like, pay a lot of like, let me actually rephrase that. If you don't have a lot of users on your website, who's going to send like a lot of requests. If you don't have that, you can use Lambda. No problem with that. So yeah, we're done with Lambda. Now we have Lightsail. So before I talk about Lightsail, I need to talk about like virtual machines on the cloud. Now, I think most of you know what virtual machines are, and like on the cloud, it's kind of like a VPS. Now, it basically is a virtual machine system on AWS, but it doesn't actually offer you a lot of options for tiers. Okay, so you have to select from the select few options that AWS gives you. So yeah, but the good thing with Lightsail is that it abstracts away a lot of the complex stuff that you can like you needed to manage. But if you want to like dive deep into infrastructure, then Lightsail is probably not for you because it abstracts away a lot of the stuff. And it's not like burstable high performance as EC2. Like EC2 is like another virtual machine. cloud compute system that AWS provides. So if you're like just some ordinary guy who wants to like deploy a simple web application without worrying much about anything or without customizing or going deep into your infrastructure, then sure you can use Lightsail, but you wouldn't have many options for selecting the tiers for your virtual machine. So personally, I would not use Lightsail, and I don't recommend anyone to use Lightsail. Okay, that's like a no-no for me. Next, we have AppRunner. Now, AppRunner it's kind of like Elastic Beanstalk. Yeah, it's a lot like Elastic Beanstalk, but ladies and gentlemen, AppRunner basically like it abstracts away so much stuff and doesn't give you the option to dive deep into your infrastructure. Like Elastic Beanstalk, even if it abstracts away a lot of the stuff, like manages a lot of the stuff, it's still like if you want to, you can still, dive deep into your infrastructure and configure it and like, use it the way you want. Elastic Beanstalk offers like you can do that with Elastic Beanstalk, but with AppRunner, it just abstracts away everything. You just deploy your application and boom. So you can't actually customize it or like just, like modify your infrastructures or stuff like with AppRunner. So yeah, personally, I wouldn't use AppRunner. Okay, if I needed like if someone asked me which one would you use, Elastic Beanstalk or AppRunner, I would say Elastic Beanstalk, not AppRunner. So yeah, AppRunner is also another no-no from me. So let me actually, like cross these out and put it like this. So Elastic Container Service, Elastic Beanstalk, boom. Okay, so at last we have EC2. Now, EC2 is probably one of the most popular services that AWS has to offer. And the reason is, it's virtual machines on the cloud, but you can scale it. Okay, you can scale it as much as you want. You have auto scaling, and you can scale it up and down. And the thing is, it's like, it basically has burstable performance tiers, where if for some reason you have unplanned traffic spikes, your EC2 can be configured to auto scale and it will auto scale to handle the traffic. And then if it doesn't have a lot of traffic, it will just scale down to its normal tier or normal state. Now with EC2, so as I was talking about Lightsail under the hood, it uses EC2, but it abstracts away a lot of the EC2 stuff. But with EC2, you have direct access to your server's infrastructure, what it's doing, how it's running. Basically, EC2 is like, it just doesn't abstract away anything. And even with like Elastic Container Service and Elastic Beanstalk, both of them run EC2, but Elastic Container Service has Fargate, but like we're not going to talk about Fargate for now. But if you select the EC2 option for Elastic Container Service, it's also going to run EC2, and that means you can customize it and configure it the way you want. Elastic Beanstalk also does the same thing. It's just, instead of giving you direct access to the EC2 instances, it just manages all of the stuff like by its own, so like by itself. So Elastic Beanstalk is like a managed service, but if you want, you can like customize the EC2 instance if you wish to. So if you are just starting out as a beginner in terms of like in cloud computing and stuff, I would recommend you use EC2 because it's simple to use. And if, let's say, your application has a lot of traffic, you can scale it up and down, and you have about 250 options for tiers. So you can select the tier, and you can select the type of VPS for your specific need. You can have memory optimized, you can have GPU optimized, you can have storage optimized, CPU optimized, or you can have general purpose virtual machines, which is a really, really nice thing. And since almost all of the AWS services run on EC2, that means EC2 is actually good. Okay, so you can use EC2 for almost anything. Maybe let's say Docker containers or like a web application or some kind of background task or a database. That's up to you. And EC2 is also pretty cost efficient if your application has traffic, because for something like Lambda, if your application has a lot of traffic, you'll be charged for every single request and the amount of time every single request takes. But with EC2, it doesn't matter how many requests your server gets, you will only be charged for the amount of time your EC2 instance is running for and the amount of cores and RAM it uses. So like, let's say you got 2 virtual CPU cores, you got like 4 gigabytes of RAM on a VP on an EC2 instance, and let's say you get like 1,000 requests. The 1,000 requests won't be a problem. You will only be like, you only have to pay for the 2 virtual CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. And if you scale up, you pay for the amount of resources you have now after scaling up. So that's why I like EC2. But the thing is, if your website has a low amount of requests and almost nobody visits your website or like uses your web application, I don't think you should use EC2, because it doesn't matter if you utilize the resources or not, you'll still be charged full for the amount of resources that you have allocated to your EC2. So let's say I got like 1 gigabyte of RAM on my EC2 instance, but my server is taking like only 50 megabytes, and there's like barely no users. There's like barely any users. Then yeah, you'll still be charged for the 1 gigabyte of RAM. And that's the reason I don't recommend you use EC2 unless your website is going to have some traffic. If your website has a low amount of traffic, use something like Lambda, because with Lambda, you'll only be charged for the small amount of requests, like every single request. So since you're going to have a low amount of requests, I think it's best if you use something like Lambda if your website has low traffic. But if your website is like, has like what, decent amount of traffic, and even if it's like a business application where you got like tons of traffic, you can still use EC2. I've seen startups using EC2, like no Elastic Beanstalk, just beefed up EC2 instances for their applications, and it works perfectly fine. And with EC2, you don't need to configure a load balancer unless you have multiple EC2 instances. But what I would do if I had multiple EC2 instances is I would spin up another EC2 instance, configure Nginx on it as a load balancer, and then use that EC2 instance acting as a load balancer to load balance the traffic between the other EC2 instances. So I would try my best to avoid using the Elastic Load Balancer, but that can have its downsides if you have a lot of traffic, since that single load balancing EC2 won't be able to handle a lot of traffic. But yeah, this is just my opinion on which services you should use, and if you are a startup, or even if you're like just a beginner or someone who's like new to cloud computing, you can use EC2, and that is the service that I will recommend to everyone. So yeah, that is my opinion on which services you should use for deploying your web app or API on AWS. So I hope you found this video helpful. And then again, I'm saying this again, this video is purely my opinion. Okay, if none of my opinions match with yours, don't worry. I'm not saying that it's a fact, but it's just my opinion. So thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace out.